In the information provided by the Sun, there were detailed examples of some typical subsidiary gods, but most of the information didn't provide their true names, only their title. These included the god of beauty and the goddess of life, who were subsidiaries to vampire ancestor Lilith, the goddess of misfortune, and the god of the dead, who were subsidiaries to annihilation demonic wolf Phlegria, the god of luck, and the queen of calamity, who were subsidiaries to elf king Soniathrum, and so on and so forth. Queen of Calamity. Klein suddenly thought of the Book of Calamity and the golden wine cup he had taken from the ruins of the High Elf. The name Kohinum and the word calamity was engraved on it in Elvish. This caused him to make the connection that Kohinum was the elf king's subsidiary, Queen of Calamity. Unfortunately, I can't directly seek confirmation with Little Sun. I'll have to wait for further information from him. Klein sighed silently. At the same time, he made some theories about the fact that these titles didn't correspond with their true name. The City of Silver was originally the Kingdom of Silver that came under the Giant King's court's rule. Other than having sufficient understanding of its own forces and enemies, the information regarding the other ancient gods will only come from legends and rumors, and they aren't that detailed. Compared to the simple and easy-to-understand titles, a god's true name can consist of complicated and difficult words to remember, which can make it harder for them to be spread. The information provided to Klein when he turned over the page confirmed his theory. However, it gave him new doubts. The dragons also had a dragon of wisdom, which was the equivalent of a god in the City of Silver, called Harabergen, and under Giant King Ormir, there was also his eldest son, the god of dawn, Badheilbrun, and his queen, the goddess of harvest. Why doesn't the goddess of harvest have a real name? Isn't she the queen of the Giant King's court? The City of Silver should have records of it. These so-called subsidiary gods are equal to the angels or king of angels of later time. Yes, the sequence 2 of their pathway, and sequence 1s of the other pathway. Klein suppressed his perplexion and inferred the truth from the information recorded in the card of blasphemy within the same pathway. If there was a sequence 0, then there wouldn't be a sequence 1, and if there was no sequence 0, then there would be at most 3 sequence 1. However, Klein didn't dare to base his judgment on this. After all, his knowledge was partial, and he didn't even know if there were any preconditions for the sequence 0 and sequence 1, which was derived from the law of Beyonder characteristics conservation and indestructibility. I'll assume this for the time being. Klein leaned back, letting the information in his hands disappear, smiling as he said, "You may begin." At this point, Alger was still seriously examining himself. After considering how to communicate properly, he used the technique of being in the other person's shoes. He started from the point of view of the hermit, who was suspected of being Admiral of Stars, to see what exactly he had exposed. Mr. Fools protects every member's true identity with a blurred and distorted image, but this method doesn't affect the representation of color. Dark brown colors can be difficult to distinguish, but bright colors are easily grasped. At the very least, I can tell that Miss Justice is blonde with bright green eyes, and for me, the most obvious thing I can't hide is my dark blue hair. But this doesn't say anything. It's not a problem to say that dark blue hair is a common mutation in Beyonders within the Sailor pathway, but the converse isn't true. This is because such traits are hereditary. On Sonya Island and in the Berserk Sea around Daisy Bay, they were places where elves originally gathered. Many humans with traces of elvish blood will also have dark blue hair. It's the same for districts where there are a certain number of Church of Storms Beyonders. Ignoring any other trait, it's difficult for the hermit to determine any further information based on the situation. Just as Alger heaved a sigh of relief, he caught sight of the storm robe he was wearing. After returning to the Blue Avenger, not only was he the captain of the ship, but he was also the bishop of the sailor. He often needed to wear the corresponding clothes to celebrate Mass. If he didn't show his devotion in his daily actions, there might come a day when he would be reported by his subordinates. The Church of Storms has always been wary of those members who had been drifting out at sea for a long time, as prolonged acting as pirates might one day turn them into real pirates. In any case, the Lord of Storms has never given a revelation to exclude pirates from his followers. Under the cover of that blurred distortion, it's hard to see the details of one's clothing clearly. This isn't a problem, however. I still have to pay attention in the future. During tarot gatherings, I should change into a set of ordinary clothes. Although I can't be sure, I still have to treat her as a pirate admiral. I can't afford to be careless, Alger thought cautiously. At this moment, he heard the seemingly suppressed voice of the moon Emlyn, which was a result of him being unable to hide his emotion. "Mr. Hanged Man, I've done the preparation. When can you obtain the inheritance of that sanguine baron? You mentioned before that it's in the hands of some powerful pirate." You didn't have to say the last sentence. Alger's body instantly stiffened. Powerful pirate. The hermit's eyes swept over the hanged man once again. Alger's expression didn't change as he turned his head to the moon and asked, "Have you obtained the fund?" "Of course." Emlyn raised his neck. He originally wanted to wait until the 3-month maturity was up before he went to the bank to withdraw the money, but he soon discovered that he was in a completely different mood after deciding to buy the sanguine baron's inheritance. He no longer had any qualms or hesitation. He was filled with expectation and desire, wishing that he could get his hands on it immediately. It was just like how he felt in the past when he was about to buy a beloved dog. He had held back for more than a week before finally giving up by selling the acceptance draft. Although he had lost some money, it was still acceptable. In many situations, an acceptance draft could be used as a currency. "I'll get it for you within the week. Finally, let's confirm the price for £500. Is that all right?" Seeing that a deal was about to be struck, Alger didn't pursue the moon's act of exposing it. Emlyn thought about the dolls in his room, cleared his throat, and said with his eyes furtively darting around, "Can it be cheaper? TT's not up to me to decide, but I can try to acquire it for you at a lower price. Also, don't forget my commission. Let's lower it. How about £300? Alger's tone didn't change at all. "All right." Emlyn exhaled quietly. Not a very powerful vampire, an underaged or a recently matured one, Katlia silently watched from the sidelines and made her judgment. Seeing that the deal between Mr. Hanged Man and Mr. Moon had been concluded in a few sentences, Audrey habitually felt that she should buy something. "In a week or two, I'll contact the members of the Psychology Alchemists in Eastchester County and tell them that V become a Psychology Alchemists member. I'll exchange my contribution point for the subsequent potion formula. There's no need to make a request to purchase it here for the time being. Once I find out what ingredients are needed, I can ask for everyone's help. There's no need to buy any mystical items for now. I've already had one of them reimbursed. Being able to obtain such rare items with too great a frequency might imply many problems." Audrey's thoughts raced, and she came up with an idea. She turned halfway and looked at the gloomy man at the end of the table. "Mr. World, you mentioned that you have clues to the characteristic left behind by a psychiatrist. Have you successfully acquired it?" "I plan on buying it for Susie," she silently added in her heart. In fact, when she was considering this matter, she had another slightly mischievous idea, which was to find an excuse for Mr. Fool to turn over the Dark Emperor card which sat beside him. From her point of view, Ma'am Hermit was particularly affected by the matter regarding Roselle's diary. And from how her reaction was extraordinarily excessive before she quickly hid it, it was quite possible that she knew about the cards of blasphemy. Therefore, the moment she saw it, she would expose a lot of problems and express the truest thoughts in her heart. But she dismissed the idea in the end, not because she thought it would be bad to sound out Ma'am Hermit, but that this was a way of showing responsibility to both herself and the Tarot Club, and that she shouldn't make decisions for Mr. Fool. If he wanted Ma'am Hermit to recognize the card of blasphemy, he definitely would have flipped it open himself. If he didn't want to do so, then any attempts would be against his will. Audrey nodded solemnly but almost imperceptibly. At this moment the world replied hoarsely, "If you're certain that you want it, then I will give it to you as soon as possible. The price is £1,800. Normally, it would be more appropriate to charge £1,200 to £1,500 for a psychiatrist's Beyonder characteristic, but Klein had raised the premium slightly to see how much Miss Justice could pay." "All right," Audrey agreed with a light tone. She had paid off the money owed to Viscount Glain. She had received many gifts for having reached adulthood after returning to her family's feet. It was a time when her finances were in a rather good condition. She had even arranged for the money to be returned to Mr. Fool's blessed next month. In the future, her monthly income would be above £3,000, and a substantial portion of her normal expenses wasn't going to be borne by her, due to the love of her parents and the results of her previous meritorious exploits. While the two were discussing, the hanged man was somewhat surprised. The world had just sold the faceless Beyonder characteristic the previous time, and he had recently acquired Steel Mavetti's Beyonder characteristic. Yet he appeared to have a psychiatrist characteristic in his collection, and all of this happened in less than a month. On second thought, Alger quickly came to an understanding. The world represented a group of blessed of Mr. Fool. That might be the harvest from the other blessed. As he imagined this, the world who was Klein was in a state of shock towards Miss Justice's opulence. He had thought that Miss Justice, who had just spent £5,500 on a mystical item, wouldn't be as well off as before. It was just like last year, so he had reserved space for her to haggle. Who knew that she would still agree to the deal without hesitation. As she dug up a gold mine, Klein couldn't help but silently lampoon. Seeing that they had finished their discussion, Derek hurriedly raised his hand, having learned from Miss Justice. Which one of you has the fruit of the Radiant Spirit Pact tree? He had rather successfully collected the other ingredients of the Solar High Priest potion. Just as Catlia had initially figured out that Miss Justice was a yet-to-advance psychiatrist, she heard this request. After a few seconds of silence, she said, "I do. What can you provide in exchange?" After observing for a long time, she decided to intervene in a small transaction to gain a deeper understanding of how the Tarot Club operated. I can use the history of the City of Silver or the history of dragons, elves, and other dark creatures to barter, Derek said sincerely. Ma'am Hermit, this is a list of commonly seen monsters around the City of Silver. You can choose any ingredients you need from it. How honest, Klein almost looked up at the dome of the magnificent palace. What is he talking about? Catlia frowned slightly, momentarily failing to understand a single word from the sun. Which way the wind blows. After a brief moment of consideration, the hermit Catlia made the choice that benefited her the most. She said without betraying her emotions, "I'll make a decision after seeing what the commonly seen monsters are around the City of Silver." Another person who gains something without risking anything of her own are the people who spend too much time at sea good at fleecing others. Or his little son in such a state that makes it impossible to resist fleecing him. Klein instinctively excluded himself from the group of seafarers. All right. Under Justice and Company's scrutiny, Derek didn't hesitate to agree to Ma'am Hermit's request. He recalled the content and conjured it, recording the most commonly seen monsters around the City of Silver into a list. However, it wasn't as detailed as before, and there were quite a few missing. After all, the Sun Pathway's improvement in regards to his memory was rather limited. A few days had passed. Catlia received the piece of information and read through it in a serious manner. The more she scanned through it, the more alarmed she became. This was because the types of monsters had far exceeded her expectations by nearly 100 times. Most of the names used were ancient names. If not for her being a Moses ascetic order member who had been pursued by knowledge, and having reached sequence 5, making her experienced and knowledgeable, there was no way she could have known what these names would really be referring to. But even so, there were still a few monsters she had never heard of. They were like shadows who would never reveal themselves in dreams or imaginations, forever lurking in the depths of the darkness. Where exactly is the City of Silver? Why are there so many monsters? 10 seconds later, Catlia raised her head without a change in expression. She said with a staid tone, "Use the history of your City of Silver in exchange." All right. Derek's eyes lit up as he seemed to see hope in advancing. He soon conjured the historical materials of the City of Silver with the help of Mr. Fool. Having had ample experience, he knew that even more complete and detailed information was worth more than the fruit of a Radiant Spirit Pact tree. Hence, he retained some of what he knew. Catlia knew that she wasn't Mr. Fool, so it was impossible for her to let the members patiently wait for her to finish reading. Therefore, she casually flipped through it. After confirming its value, she deliberated and asked, "How should I hand over the fruit of the Radiant Spirit Pact tree to you?" Just as she said that, she suddenly thought of something. With a guess, she looked to the end of the long bronze table. "Mr. Fool, is it done by a sacrificial ritual?" This left Audrey, who had prepared the answer, to be clearly stunned. She swallowed the words that she was about to say. Ma'am Hermit is very impressive and knowledgeable. She directly guessed that it's done via a sacrificial and bestowment ritual. Audrey controlled her minute facial expressions as she clicked her tongue and sighed inwardly. Yes. Klein gently nodded without going into detail. He believed that it was impossible for a pirate admiral, a Sequence 5 powerhouse of the Mystery Prior Pathway, to not know how a sacrifice was made. This was even something they were good at. Furthermore, she knew the fool's honorific name, so she didn't lack any of the necessary condition. Indeed, with a godlike existence bearing witness to gathering, a sacrificial and bestowment method is the safest and most convenient way of trading, and a conversation through the soul body can result in direct knowledge transfer. Catlia thanked him before saying to the son, "I'll do it as soon as possible." Although she didn't show any abnormalities, her heart was in no way calm. From her casual flipping of the information provided by the son, she discovered that the city of Silver was truly filled with oddity. It included matters about being forsaken by the Lord, how it didn't have a sun, resulting in a state of eternal darkness and high and low frequency light. Matters like how strange and terrifying monsters hid in the darkness when there was no light, and how they survived thanks to black-faced grass. It mentioned that they had survived for more than 2,000 years since the Dark Age. All of this exceeded Catlia's expectation. As a powerhouse at sea who was knowledgeable and had acquired many secrets, she instantly connected the time and descriptions to a famous concept in history, the cataclysm. Following that, she followed this line of thought and made a further inference. The forsaken land of the gods. Suddenly, the figure she looked up to surfaced in Catlia's mind once again. A sentence filled with an emotive sigh surfaced. He had always been searching for the forsaken land of the gods back when he was alive. He said that the ultimate answer towards everything is hidden there. The sun comes from the forsaken land of the gods, which Emperor Roselle couldn't find despite all his efforts. Mr. Fool can connect to that place directly. No, perhaps he awoke from that place, Catalia thought in alarm and solemnity. She had previously belittled the Tarot Club because the moon, justice, and the sun were of low sequences. She believed that with Mr. Fool having awoken only recently, he was obviously unable to pull members of significant strength. However, she now had to reevaluate matters. It involves the forsaken land of the gods, the Church of Storms, the Church of Mother Earth, the lone aristocrats perhaps. It's precisely because they're low sequences that these members can be nurtured to be able to reach higher ranks in their respective circles without being suspected. This will allow them to play a more important role. As for me, is it because of the Moses ascetic order or Her Majesty? Catlia seriously analyzed the motives of Mr. Fool. At this moment, the transactions were nearly coming to an end. The moon, the sun, and justice had all confirmed their respective transactions. As for the hermit Catlia, she was still observing. Out of caution, she didn't rashly open her mouth to expose more information about herself. Alger had originally planned on making a request to buy the Sequence 5 Ocean Songster's potion formula so that he could make the subsequent preparations. But with the addition of the hermit, he became especially wary. He gave up on his decision at the last minute and prepared to push it back until he had really advanced to Wind Blessed. Only with him being stronger would he have the room to breathe. As Fours would be able to obtain the astrologer potion formula and a certain amount of ingredients from her teacher soon, she hadn't prioritized her purchases yet, so all she did was watch silently. She actually curbed her desire to buy a mystical item to make up for her relatively showy trickmaster powers that were lacking in strength, as well as how her apprentice powers were only good for passing through walls and opening doors. However, her real-life circumstances restricted her desire. Up to this day, her savings had exceeded £400. For a member of the middle class, that was rather good, but she clearly remembered how Miss Justice had bought a mystical item for £5,500 previously. Even if it was a relatively average mystical item without significant negative side effects, it will still require £1,000 to £2,000, Fours languidly sat there, unable to open her mouth to make a purchase. Klein controlled the world to scan his surroundings before hoarsely saying, "I need a pair of eyes from a six-winged gargoyle." The supplementary ingredients of a nimble right master, Drago bark, and the spring water from Sonya Island's Golden Spring were commonly seen items in the mysterious world. As long as he purchased them at different occasions, he wouldn't garner suspicion from anyone. Therefore, Klein only requested for the eyes of a six-winged gargoyle. The hermit glanced at the world and said without rushing, £300, or the equivalent cost in gold coins. She had noticed that the previous transactions were all made in Loan's gold pound. As expected of the Admiral of Stars, who has a pirate crew with an ancient faction backing her. She is very resourceful, and her prices are cheaper than usual, if not for Little Sun's imminent advancement, and how he would soon obtain the method for removing the mental corruption of a Beyonder characteristic. I would have even consulted her on this problem, Klein thought as he made the world smile deeply. Okay, With the transaction completed, the palace that resembled a giant's residence fell silent for more than 10 seconds. Without Mr. Fool's reminder, Justice, the Sun, and company knew that they had entered the free exchange segment. Hanged Man Alger deliberately looked at Miss Justice and Miss Magician without looking at Ma'am Hermit. Something major recently happened in the Rorsted archipelago. He didn't plan on divulging the world's involvement, since it was very likely that Mr. Fool was in possession of the sea god's identity. If he were to rashly confirm this matter, it might spoil Mr. Fool's plans and throw himself into danger. He planned on using a normal tone to mention the happenings on the surface, while emphasizing the Moses Ascetic Order member, archaeologist and adventurer, Letitia. He planned on using this to sound out the hermit to figure out if she was Admiral of Stars, Catalina. This was because this pirate admiral was rumored to also be a member of the Moses Ascetic Order. What happened? Justice asked with piqued interest. Alger said calmly, a disguised archaeologist, Letitia, discovered an ancient elvish ruin in Simim Island and took out an item from it. This pushed the deity the locals believed in, sea god Calvatua, to be on the brink of collapse. This fake god wished to create tsunamis to drown the island so that everyone could accompany it in its death, but it was stopped by the Church of Storms' Sea King. Finally, Letitia was found and Calvatua had died. The threat of the tsunamis was leveled, but strangely, the devout believers of the sea god would still occasionally receive responses. Letitia is dead. For an ancient elvish ruin, Katlia had heard of this archaeologist, who was part of the same organization before, but she wasn't too familiar with her. This was because formal members of the Moses Ascetic Order had to spend a certain amount of time in silent ascetic training. When fully paying attention, she was able to control her powers in a way that significantly exceeded the average person. Therefore, she only seemed slightly stirred as she listened seriously to the hanged man's description, without showing any obvious abnormality. When the hanged man said that Calvatua was dead, and how the sea god still responded to its believers, Katlia first frowned in puzzlement before using her spiritual intuition to recall a certain scene. Yesterday, she had seen Mr. Fool hold a milky-white scepter when he pulled her above the gray fog. At the tip of the scepter were many tiny blue gems, which were swirling with countless points of holy light. And more importantly, it emanated an aura of godhood, one that seemed like the corporeal aura of the ocean and storm. This, Katlia instinctively turned her head to the end of the long bronze table, where Mr. Fool was shrouded in the grayish-white fog. Denying why is she looking at Mr. Fool? Audrey sharply noticed the hermit's subtle motion. This left her somewhat suspicious. From her point of view, this was an atypical response. Mr. Hanged Man was clearly mentioning something that had little to do with everyone. He was talking about the so-called sea god Calvatua's ability to occasionally reply to its believers despite its apparent death. So why would Ma'am Hermit look towards Mr. Fool? Calvatua's death, occasionally replying to its believers. Ma'am Hermit is looking at Mr. Fool. Could it be? Audrey's eyes lit up as she came to a conclusion. Could it be that Mr. Fool is the one replying to Calvatua's believer? Ma'am Hermit knows about this so. As thoughts whizzed through her mind, Audrey had turned her body halfway to look expectantly at Mr. Fool, who was seated leisurely at the end of the long bronze table. Meanwhile, Alger was also surprised and alarmed about the hermit's unexpected reaction. I was only trying to sound her out about what connection she has with the Moses Ascetic Order member, Letitia. Why would she suddenly turn to look at Mr. Fool? Could it be that she knows that the current sea god is a manifestation of Mr. Fool? Her reaction implies this is highly likely. Before she was recruited into the Tarot Club, did she have a lot of secret exchanges with Mr. Fool and was already secretly working for him? The more Alger thought, the more he paid attention to the hermit. Then he subconsciously joined her in looking towards Mr. Fool, who was shrouded in the grayish-white fog. He, the hermit, and Justice turned around at different times, but their nearly unanimous actions made the magician Fours and company notice something amiss. Why are they looking at Mr. Fool? Does sea god Calvatua's death have to do with Mr. Fool? Believing they were smart, Fours and Emlyn began guessing at the reason as they cast their gaze to the end of the long bronze table. Derek didn't know who sea god Calvatua was, nor did he understand what it meant for it to respond to its believers even after its death. However, since everyone was looking at Mr. Fool, he naturally looked over as well. The world was late by a second, as though he was deliberating over something. He first scanned the hanged man, making him shudder in fear. Then he changed the direction of his gaze. At this point, Klein had already come to realize which detail Ma'am Hermit had used to guess that he was the one replying to see God Calvatua's believers in its stead. He was still stumped over what stance to use. Should I pretend that it's a trivial matter and that I didn't take it to heart, but since you mentioned it, I'll just admit it in passing? Or should I take the stance that since I'm a god, there's no need for me to explain myself to you, so there's no need for me to admit or deny anything? Klein recalled the fool's persona and quickly made a decision. The choice was to neither admit or deny anything, so as to prevent him from losing his standing as a god. However, he would add a single sentence on a particular point, making those who had failed to guess it become more puzzled, while the suspicious ones would be enlightened but would still be left shrouded in confusion as they realized, deep down, how unfathomable Mr. Fool was. With this in mind, Klein, who had leaned back, chuckled. He said leisurely and indifferently, Calvatua became a demigod by relying on a relic left behind by Calamity Cohen. Oh, they're consulting Mr. Fool about the situation with the sea god, but that doesn't convince me. It feels like there's a deeper truth hidden behind this matter. Could it be? No way, right? Rose frowned as she began coming up with all sorts of thoughts. As expected, Catlia believed Mr. Fool was giving a straightforward answer, while also informing them of some secret. That demigod scepter is Calvatua's characteristic or Calamity Cohenum's relic, or is it something that covers both definitions? Who is Calamity Cohenum? The name sounds elvish. Yes, the hanged man mentioned that Letitia found an ancient elven ruin. It's the residence of a high elf. How did Mr. Fool get that scepter? Did he rely on the hanged man or someone else? No, it doesn't seem like the hanged man. Otherwise, he wouldn't have proactively mentioned this matter. What motive does Mr. Fool have behind responding to the sea god's believers? Is this required for his awakening, something that can truly affect reality? The more Catlia thought, the more she found Mr. Fool unfathomable. It was just like how his body was being concealed by the thick gray fog. The clearer she could see him, the more puzzled, horrified, and apprehensive she became. This might be a tussle between gods. Catlia sighed inwardly as the emotions got the better of her. I guessed right. Alger finally verified that the present sea god was a manifestation of the fool. His worries and indecision from before were instantly rewarded. On certain occasions, as a fake sea god believer, I can openly pray, I wonder how much Mr. Fool has recovered. How much of his power can he release from the seal? It's at least at the demigod level. He will be able to provide tremendous protection at sea. The hermit's unsurprised reaction implies that she had long interacted with Mr. Fool and had learned of certain things ahead of time. This implies that her sequence isn't low. She might really be a powerhouse at the pirate admiral level. This is both good and bad news for me. The good news is that I have an additional powerful faction at sea supporting me. At times, we can tacitly cooperate and complete matters that were previously deemed unimaginable. The bad news is that a lot of my news and resource channels will be overshadowed by her. My purpose in the Tarot Club will drastically decline. Of course, that's under the premise that she really is Admiral of Star. Yes, I have to adjust my focus from gathering news and resources and align it towards the church. This is something she can't supplant me, Alger thought with joy and wariness. That sea god is really Mr. Fool. No, no, no. It should be said that the present sea god is Mr. Fool's manifestation. He has truly begun interfering with the real world. This is great. In the future, I can pray to see God directly and receive a response when I'm out traveling at sea. Audrey felt surprised, overjoyed, and proud. According to what she knew, the churches didn't do fixed ritualistic magic internally. The ones who received responses by solely praying to the deities were mainly priests or a chance occurrence. Otherwise, they were blessed who just numbered at a handful. As for receiving a response from every prayer, they would be an extreme exception, even among blessed. But I can. Mr. Fool is returning to his throne, one step at a time. Replacing Sea God is one of those steps. Audrey didn't hide the changes in her emotions as she smiled, sitting straight and elegant. Kohanim? That's an elf's name. I think I've heard someone mention it before. Emlyn attempted to recall, but it was in vain. As for Calvatua's death and how the sea god still replied to its believers, as well as the reason why the hermit, Justice, the hanged man, had looked towards Mr. Fool, he had made a slight guess without thinking too deeply about the matter. What has this got to do with me? It doesn't affect my saving of the Sanguine, nor is it anything of interest. Anyway, I can just pray to Mr. Fool if there are any problems. Lin mumbled to himself, showing disdain towards the emotional changes the others had. Calamity, Queen of Calamity. But there are no records that say that her name is Kohinum. Derek turned his head to the left very slightly, a common tick he did when he recalled things. From the looks of it, Little Sun isn't sure if Kohinum is the Queen of Calamity. Otherwise, he wouldn't have such a reaction. Klein retracted his gaze in disappointment. He controlled the world to cough, pulling everyone back from their thoughts. Following that, the world conjured a picture with the fool's help. He showed it to both sides of the table and asked, "Does anyone know her?" It was a picture of the red-haired Helen. Klein mainly wanted to know if Admiral of Stars Katlia or the hanged man Alger knew her. After all, they were well-informed people out at sea. Alger glanced at it, and just as he was about to say that he didn't know her, he heard Ma'am Hermit say with a deep voice, "Red-haired Helen. She's from a fallen noble family, and has the bloodline from the Intis Sauron family." Katlia paused before adding, "She was once a trader out at sea, but she was later said to have been abducted by Ailment Maiden Tracy." Abducted by Ailment Maiden Tracy. I thought it would be some contrived story about a domineering pirate and a noble lady. However, Tracy can be considered a domineering pirate. Heh, Klein instantly made some connection. Wars was still lost in her thoughts over the connection between Sea God and the Fool when she suddenly snapped to her senses. She acutely noticed that great opportunities lay in red-haired Helen and Vice Admiral Ailment's story as she began to daydream. To her regret, Ma'am Hermit had only said a few sentences without continuing. The Hermit knows Vice Admiral Ailment, however, that doesn't imply anything. Beyonders of a certain sequence or knowledgeable people will know who the 7 pirate admirals are. Their bounty posters are everywhere. The Hermit is rather aware of matters over at Intis. This is something that can be determined for now. The hanged man wasn't interested in red-haired Helen, only the Hermit's real identity. With red-haired Helen's matter coming to close, Audrey began considering if she should consult the others about the Mind Dragon. Unlike before, there was now the addition of Ma'am Hermit, who was of unknown character and dubious allegiances. This left her hesitant. After a brief deliberation, she said, "I recently sought out the traces of a Mind Dragon and went to a place which has the tradition of worshipping dragons." She had concealed the exact location, as the details might implicate her. Audrey simply mentioned the ancient folk song, but she didn't describe the content in detail. She was afraid that the knowledgeable Ma'am Hermit would be able to guess at the exact location. She only mentioned the inspiration she had, and how she used a psychological cue to retain her lucidity in her dream before beginning a magical journey. Psychological cue. She knows how to plan a psychological cue. She's likely a Sequence 7 psychiatrist. Katlia habitually made a judgment, but she immediately felt even more perplexed. Then why would she be buying the Beyonder characteristic of a psychiatrist? Taking the same potion gives a limited increase in strength, while being prone to losing control. Furthermore, it will be an obstacle towards the digestion of the potion, to create a mystical item. But this will overlap with her own Beyonder powers. There's no value to that. To give it to someone else. Midst Katlia's guesses, Audrey had already mentioned her chaotic dream and how she came to the edge of her conscience. Then she used the conjuring method she learned from Mr. Fool to create a staircase that led downward. She then slowly delved deep into her conscious. He didn't describe in detail the various points of light in her subconscious, as it involved embarrassing secrets she didn't wish to share. She focused on her lonely and long journey with no end in sight. She also expressed how there were various monsters hiding in the surrounding grayness that placed immense pressure on her. She mentioned how she nearly broke down several times and barely managed to endure it thanks to her Beyonder power. Then she reached the point of her finally arriving at the illusory sea of collective subconscious. The memory imprints of the human pioneers and the spread and reflection of the consciousness of the surrounding creatures were presented under Audrey's coherent and unhurried description. Then it was fixed onto the dragon with grayish stone scales that had flown out from the sea of collective subconscious. There's a dragon that lives in the sea of collective subconscious. What a magical and beautiful journey. Although Miss Justice didn't encounter any enemies or danger, it still leaves me a little surreal, for I suddenly thought of a title of a book, Miss Justice's Dream Tour. While rounding things up, Audrey scanned the area and asked, Ladies and gentlemen, do you have any suggestions? You think that the Dragon City of Miracles, live side, is also hidden in the sea of collective subconscious. TF, I wish to continue searching. What should I take note of? What advanced preparations do I need to make? The hanged man Alger glanced at the hermit and said in a serious tone, I don't think you should continue exploring. TT's a very dangerous act. According to the records, most dragons are creatures with flesh and blood. This includes the mind dragon. By allowing itself to survive and swim through the so-called sea of collective subconscious, it means that the dragon you saw was a sufficiently high sequence. At the very least, it's at the level of a demigod. Before you reach sequence 5, it's best that you don't consider this. Katlia nodded and said, there are many other dangerous things in the sea of collective subconscious, the accumulated maleficent thoughts of humanity, the desires that can corrupt soul bodies, the terrifying memories since ancient times that resemble storms and waves at sea. All of these will deal severe psychological harm to you. It might prevent you from ever waking up. Besides, that's the sea of collective subconscious of all creatures, which isn't only limited to humans. There might be evil spirits, evil gods, or the consciousness of some terrifying existence hidden in there. They're like gigantic maelstroms that can devour ships. Before you truly acquire beyonder powers that allow you to travel through the sea of collective subconscious, it's best not to rashly explore too deep. Audrey, who was filled with expectations, felt disappointed. However, she couldn't help but admit that Mr. Hanged Man and Ma'am Hermit had spoken very logically and sincerely. She silently inhaled and said to herself, Audrey, don't be headstrong. Wait till your sequence 5 before making the attempt again. She totally didn't consider how difficult it was to become a sequence 5. At that level, one could even compete to become one of the 7 pirate admirals, or even make the 7 become 8. From Audrey's point of view, with Mr. Fool and the Tarot Club, as long as she was careful and calm, she would definitely be able to successfully attain that level in a year or 2 if she didn't take unnecessary risks. Only the gate to being a demigod was hard to push open. Ma'am Hermit knows a lot and is very knowledgeable. Audrey clung onto the last sliver of hope and looked towards Mr. Fool at the end of the table, hoping that this godlike existence would provide a suggestion that was different from Mr. Hanged Man or Ma'am Hermit. Don't look at me, I have no idea. Klein tried his best not to blink. His understanding of the conscious, subconscious, and the collective subconscious was still stuck at a theoretical level that spirit medium Dolly had described. He didn't understand anything more. Despite having his dreams intruded frequently, he had never thought of exploring the world outside the dream despite retaining his lucidity. Therefore, how was he to provide any suggestions to Miss Justice? In fact, he had a natural idea regarding this. However, he wasn't sure if it would work without having done any verification. In the past, even if he lacked the confidence, he could vaguely make a comment, but now, with Admiral of Stars Katlia sitting at the side, watching, it only made it easier for him to make mistakes the more he spoke. The less he spoke, the fewer mistakes he would commit. And there was no chance of making mistakes by keeping silent. What a pressure-inducing new member, Klein sighed inwardly. He didn't say a word and maintained his faint smile. If not for him being above the gray fog and how he existed in the form of a spirit body, he suspected that such highly difficult acting would make the muscles around his eyes spasm. Mr. Fool doesn't have any suggestions. Audrey retracted her gaze in depression. He stopped fantasizing about exploring the sea of collective subconscious so soon. At this moment, the Moon Emlyn, who was already turning impatient, cleared his throat. Tiev seriously researched the history handed down by a sanguine. He really is a vampire. Nurturing vampires and pulling vampires into the church is really a tradition of the Church of Mother Earth. Katlia nodded as she looked like she was listening seriously. Meanwhile, she felt that some of her conclusions needed adjustment. The moon directly expressed his identity. Does this mean that Mr. Fool has a potent deterrence, even in the outside world, that the members aren't afraid of information being leaked? It seems like I don't have to completely hide my circumstances. Emlyn paused and looked at the sun before tipping his chin. Before the cataclysm, there was no city of silver, only the kingdom of silver. If it were anyone else who had thrown such doubt on him, Derek would have hastened to retort, expressing the fact that the people of the city of silver were descendants of the kingdom of silver and that he hadn't lied. However, after glancing at Mr. Moon and sensing his smugness, Derek turned his head to the side, feeling that an explanation was beneath him. Why must I let an arrogant vampire, who doesn't acknowledge the City of Silver's history, believe me. He thought silently to himself. From his reaction, Emlyn could tell that the City of Silver was indeed related to the Kingdom of Silver. He tusked and said, the faith of the Kingdom of Silver wasn't originally Giant King Almir, but his queen, Umbella. Umbella? Derek turned his head and blurted out, our City of Silver has no records of this matter, nor are there any records of a queen named Umbella. Emlyn chuckled and spread out his hand. That's why there's nothing wrong with me saying that your City of Silver's history is flawed and incomplete, right? Clearly, there are mistakes in your records of sanguine history. You took such a roundabout way to prove this. Should I say that a vampire like you has clear logic, or that you're someone who bears grudges? Klein held back his laughter and stopped himself from sizing up Emlyn White. The moon and the sun's debate benefited him greatly, allowing him to know that the giant queen, the goddess of harvest, was named Umbella. The son Derek was just about to give a retort to Mr. Moon when he heard Ma'am Hermit speak. Umbella is the goddess of harvest from the second epoch. She's also the queen of the giant king's court. Legend has it that she perished at the end of the second epoch, but it's impossible to verify since no one has seen her corpse or relics. The goddess of harvest is really named Umbella. Derek was stunned. He wished to retort, but he was unable to say a word as this matter proved that the history of the City of Silver had several holes. He instantly felt somewhat aggrieved. When Emlyn saw this, he felt good. Pleasure rose from the depths of his heart. After another round of exchanges, the tarot gathering came to an end. Klein smiled and said, everyone, we shall meet next week. By your will. Audrey immediately got up to bow. The others weren't any slower, including the hermit Catlia. Upon returning to reality, Admiral of Stars Catlia looked at the shattered celestial globe on her desk. She then seriously recalled what had happened at the gathering. A few details made her believe that the Tarot Club involved itself in many matters that made it nothing to scoff at. And hidden deep in the gray fog was Mr. Fool. Like the world who was hidden behind thick shadows, he was unreadable and unfathomable. It was unknown what he was planning. After more than 10 seconds of silence, Catlia retrieved a pen and some paper and wrote while deliberating. Someone has been deliberately collecting the Emperor's diary pages. She didn't dare to expose any information that involved the Tarot Club, as she was afraid of being punished by Mr. Fool. All she could do was give a heads up on things that could be discovered under ordinary circumstances. After she was done writing and folding the letter, she took out a golden, exquisite harmonica she carried with her. Putting it to her lips, she blew it. In the blink of an eye, she saw the letter strangely vanish. Even though she wasn't wearing her glasses, she was unable to discover the arrival of the messenger. Phew, Catlia sighed and reached for her forehead and said silently, the pressure is really huge when participating in a gathering while under the supervision of a god. With Admiral of Stars joining, the pressure on me as the Fool has greatly increased. Klein rubbed his temples above the gray fog and directly returned to the real world. He wanted to attempt the inspiration Miss Justice had received from exploring her dreams. After a series of chores, Klein opened his locked bedroom door and looked into the living room. He saw Dennett sleeping soundly on a reclining chair. Although he had long heard it, Klein couldn't help but lampoon. It's not even 4 in the afternoon. Has this guy completely let his hair down now that he doesn't need to monitor the radio transceiver? With a thought, he gradually smiled, feeling that this was exactly what he needed. The premise of him maintaining his lucidity in dreams had involved someone invading his consciousness. Typically, his dreams were a turbid mess, which meant that he alone wasn't able to complete the experiment. After all, he couldn't plant a psychological cue on himself. Therefore, he planned on using external forces to enter the dreams of others. This way, he could maintain his lucidity like a nightmare. He originally planned on heading out to find a suitable target, but Dannett's posture was in such a perfect state that he could hardly stop himself from kicking it. No, I should be experimenting, Klein corrected his thoughts. He contemplated for a moment and didn't use a dream charm. As a Sequence 7 pyromaniac, with the ancient name being Fire Mage, Dannett's spiritual perception wasn't to be written off. Once he softly chanted an incantation that could stir the powers of nature, Dannett's would definitely be awoken. As such, it would be a question of whether he could evade the matter in a timely fashion. After some deliberation, Klein took out another thing he had prepared. It was a gem-like object that seemed dark and deep. It was the Beyonder characteristic left behind by a nightmare. It could be used to a certain extent, just like Nimblewright Master Risego's all-black eye. However, the effects were inferior to one that was from a mystical item. For example, this nightmare Beyonder characteristic didn't allow Klein to pass through the dreams of someone across the city from his inn suite, nor was he able to forcefully pull people into a dream. However, it was still simple enough to perform the most basic form of intruding into someone's dream at a close distance. Klein held the dark gem and spread out his spirituality. The illusory darkness rapidly spread before his eyes, filling his vision. Everything before his eyes were blanketed over, including Danitz. There was no longer a humanoid figure, but an ellipsoidal blob of light. Klein immediately extended his spirituality out and made contact with it. Without any warning, various scenes flooded his surroundings as they flashed rapidly. Finally, it came to stop on a ship that was dozens of meters long. It had a smoke-churning chimney and large sails that were fully raised. The deck was polished abnormally bright, shimmering with the glimmer of a gold coin when sunlight hit it. Danitz stood under the main cannon as he had his arms crossed. He was leisurely rushing the sailors, shouting from time to time, "Scrub that area again." "Dog's Tea, do you wish to copy down the ancient Fasak dictionary?" This fellow is quite impressive on the Golden Dream. Klein ignored the owner of the dream and flew to the other end of the ship. He found a hidden spot and landed on the deck before preparing to test his spiritual perception. What he planned on experimenting on was simple. He wanted to know if chanting the fool's honorific name in a dream was effective. He wanted to know if he could sense someone praying. This way, if Miss Justice encounters danger in the sea of collective subconscious, she can use this method to seek help. After stretching his back, Klein's expression gradually turned solemn as he softly said, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era." The mysterious ruler above the gray fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck. With the words in Hermes being spoken, he very quickly finished reciting the fool's honorific name. However, Klein didn't hear the series of illusory pleas. "It doesn't work." Klein frowned in thought. He analyzed whether it was really impossible or if he had made a mistake somewhere. Yes, chanting in the dream doesn't actually produce any noise. Relying on Hermes alone isn't sufficient. To achieve the effects of praying, I'll have to use a language like ancient Hermes that can stir the powers of nature. This is the same state as me copying the account password of my anonymous account. Klein nodded slightly and began to chant his honorific name in ancient Hermes. He wasn't afraid that there would be an accident, but that his stirring of the powers of nature would wake blazing Danitz from his sleep. He recited each word, quickly finishing the 3 sentences. Following that, Klein heard the stacked series of irritable and illusory pleas. At that moment, Danitz's dream quivered as the golden dream quickly disintegrated. Klein didn't stay any longer and immediately left. He returned back to his bedroom before Danitz woke up. After 7 to 8 seconds, Danitz sat up in a daze as he muttered to himself in fear. "Why did I dream of that madman Jayaman Sparrow causing trouble on the Golden Dream? What a terrifying matter. Dog's Tea. It must be the result of me worrying over this matter all this time." Inside the bedroom, Klein had already taken 4 steps counterclockwise and gone above the gray fog. Without any surprises, he saw a rippling light by the fool's high-backed chair. And it was the scene of him in the dream. It really works. One can still receive a response when chanting the fool's honorific name in languages such as ancient Hermes or Yot. It's no wonder some people might suddenly die in their sleep despite not doing a thing. They might be reading some materials or had memorized certain symbols in the day and accidentally replicated them in the dream. The danger in this world really cannot be prevented. Klein dispelled the rippling light and considered if he should inform Miss Justice of the results of the experiment. To only inform her later instead of saying it on the spot is a little damaging to the fool's image, but Miss Justice is the kind of girl with a huge sense of curiosity. Although she's been warned by Mr. Hanged Man and Admiral of Stars, and even if she's a little more mature now, there's still the chance of her taking risks. Of course, if anything were to happen, it's on herself, and it has nothing to do with me. Klein couldn't help but recall Miss Justice's adoration of the fool and the thought of her optimism and cheerfulness that brought him happiness, as well as her contributions towards the Tarot Club all this time. Finally, he sighed and said in a self-deprecating manner, "I still need to inform her and give a warning." This is the treatment a VIP gets. After making the decision, Klein didn't hesitate to spread out his spirituality to touch the crimson star representing Miss Justice. In a room of the huge manor in Eastchester County, Audrey had her legs leaning sideways as she sat before her dressing table. She was recalling the words Mr. Hanged Man and Ma'am Hermit had said. After being warned by two senior Bayonders, she suddenly realized something. It wasn't that the mid and upper echelons of the psychology alchemist wasn't aware that one could explore dreams, the icy mountain of the subconscious, and the sea of collective subconscious by using a self-induced psychological cue. The reason why they didn't tell me anything is because it's too dangerous for a psychiatrist. Many people have already died in such explorations, but they should warn me. Ah, right. From their point of view, I'm only a sequence 8 telepathist. I'm not equipped with the powers of a psychological cue, so there was no need to warn me. Audrey finally understood the perplexing matter. Just as she was about to let Susie enter the room to calm the disappointment in her heart, she suddenly saw thick gray fog spew out, instantly flooding her vision. In the middle of the endless grayish-white, a figure sat in a high-backed chair. Looking down at her, it said, "Do not make attempts without careful consideration." Before Audrey realized what was happening, she heard the deep and majestic voice sound out again. "If you encounter dangers in your dreams, you can recite my name." "Recite your name." Audrey's eyes widened as she became overjoyed. "Yes, Mr. Fool." Seeing that Miss Justice was excited instead of showing any doubts, Klein secretly heaved a sigh of relief and chuckled. "Use ancient Hermes." With that said, his figure faded away and the gray fog vanished. Audrey sat there stunned for 2 seconds before hurriedly pursing her lips, afraid that she wasn't on her best behavior. Mr. Fool actually specially warned me. He even permitted me to recite his name in my dream. Audrey excitedly took a few steps on the spot, believing that she had really become a blessed of God. Of course, she also remembered Mr. Fool's warning. She planned to understand more from the psychology alchemists and make another attempt only when she was sufficiently prepared. The corners of her mouth curled up slightly as she randomly tapped her chest, saying silently, "May Mr. Fool watch over me, Tilda." Above the gray fog, Klein began to consider another matter. Red-haired Helen, who had a reward worth £1,000, was actually related to Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy. Tracy took over Kalangos' crew and changed his flagship to the Black Death. As for Kalangos, he previously plundered a tycoon named Jimmy Necker. That tycoon had previously obtained parts of Death's chronicles. It came from a Balam royal family's mausoleum. This information came from that nightmare inside Creeping Hunger. It should benefit Mr. Azek to a certain extent. I can also investigate the matter in passing. Klein found another reason to look forward to finding red-haired Helen. He originally planned on using the magic mirror, Arrows, to find her, but now he planned on mobilizing sea god believers to perform a search. In the past, it's quite demeaning to send a revelation for just £1,000. But now that it involves a pirate admiral, it can barely make people guess that there are secret motives behind it. Klein conjured red-haired Helen's photo and summoned the sea god scepter. He had never done a mass revelation, so it was possible that it would be a burden that he couldn't withstand. He chose higher-ups like Khaled and Edmonton. With waves reaching high into the sky as a background, he said in a deep voice, "Find her and protect her. Be careful of Tracy's forces." Klein didn't provide further explanations as he broke down this scene, along with red-haired Helen's photo, into many sets, before projecting them into the corresponding dots of light. In reality, in a forest in Blue Mountain Island, where the Resistance base was located. Sitting in a wheelchair, Khaled raised his bald head and looked towards the sunlight that was scattering at the cave's entrance. His eyes couldn't hide his joy. He acutely sensed that ever since God reappeared over the land and stated his 10 commandments, the previous bloodshed and chaos had changed. From time to time, he would provide them with guidance which was filled with wisdom. Furthermore, he would observe all creatures and proactively interfere with the situation at sea in a bid to help the Resistance and everyone in Rorsted, allowing them to pass through a difficult, thorny path while still being able to see some hope. Perhaps this is the true meaning behind his reappearance over the land. Khaled recalled the revelation he had just received and guessed that the red-haired woman named Helen was like a fulcrum for Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy and the forces out at sea. She was the key to spoiling the balance between the countries, and only by making the world situation more chaotic would the people of Rorsted receive the opportunity of being liberated. Khaled drew in a breath and quickly set up a ritual to pray to see God, conjuring Helene's picture. After doing all of this, he instinctively turned his head to the side and wore a somewhat mixed expression. Living in that direction was the high priest of the Church of Sea God, a priest who was a high-ranking member of the resistance. Although they don't dare go against the revelations and have made tremendous changes in many ways, they're still immersed in the past. They're obstinate, conservative, backward, and savage. They refuse to embrace a more civilized church. If this goes on, they'll one day be abandoned by God. Khaled couldn't hide the smile in his heart while he felt a strong sense of anguish. After scanning through all the believers' prayers and picking a few to respond to, Klein returned to the real world. He planned on heading out to search for a chance to enact true act. When his right hand gripped the door handle, a ridiculous but possible thought came to his mind. My true goal is not to find red-haired Helene, but to use this opportunity to get to Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy and figure out what happened to Tycoon Jimmy Necker, so as to get to know the location of the ancient chronicles of death. That is to say, I only need to lure Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy out with red-haired Helene. As for whether she's the real person or not, that doesn't matter. I can make myself red-haired Helene and let Danitz send me to Strongman Ozzo, get the reward, and easily meet Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy. What an impressive sequence of actions. Klein suddenly shook his head as he found a reason to reject the idea. Although I'm a faceless, I can't accept wearing drag. Could it be that overcoming my inner resistance is also one of the principles for acting? Furthermore, I don't know red-haired Helene. Acting as her wouldn't work. I would just be like her on the surface, and I wouldn't be able to fool people who are familiar with her. That way, I won't be able to meet Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy. Yes, the person searching for red-haired Helene might not be Tracy, but an enemy of her. I don't know Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy's background. Rashly doing such an act would result in immeasurable danger. It's best to be safe and abide by my wishes. I'll first search for red-haired Helene, and after determining the details, I can consider the subsequent action. At that moment, Klein suddenly felt that something was amiss in the living room. Danitz's snoring had softened, and the time between each snore short. Vice Admiral Iceberg is here. Klein turned the handle and opened the door to the bedroom. While making this silent action, Danitz sat up with his eyes open. He tried hard to hide his smile as he said, "Captain came. She said that Admiral of Blood's crew was sighted at Longtail Island and is continuing south. His destination seems to be the Berserk Sea. The source of the news is trustworthy. Longtail Island, the island at the southern end of the Rorsted Sea. From the looks of it, Admiral of Blood previously planned on coming to Bayam, but the fight between Calvatua and C. King John Cotman scared him away. He circled around the area and headed straight for the Berserk Sea. Yes, it's probably because his intelligence officer, Old Quinn, didn't send a telegram to inform him. Klein felt pangs of regret and could only lament how reality changed faster than his plan. He had planned to make his hunt of Admiral of Blood become the crowning battle of the crazy adventurer and bounty hunter, J.M. Sparrow. Killing a single steel Mavetti ultimately lacks that shock and awe effect. Klein didn't say a word as he calmly looked at Danitz. Danitz felt a little uneasy from the intense stare as he gave a hollow chuckle. Admiral of Blood has fled. Your cooperation with Captain has come to an end, right? T can now return to the Golden Dream, right? Further developments can be done via your messenger. Klein pondered for a moment and took out a piece of paper from his pocket. He scribbled the method to summon his messenger. Following that, he flicked his wrist, sending the piece of paper out like a metallic plate. Danitz was a hunter at Sequence 9, so he easily reached out and caught the piece of paper. He scanned it before a scarlet flame rose in his palms, burning the paper to ashes. Haha, even if I forget it, Captain will have a way of making me recall it. He paused and squeezed out a smile before asking again, I can now return to the Golden Dream, right? Klein nodded slightly and said, yes. I can. Danitz held back his urge to pump his fist in celebration, afraid that he would end up antagonizing the madman, J.M. Sparrow. He smiled cautiously and said, I'll first pay off the room for this period of time and buy a ship ticket. As you know, Bayam hasn't been calm recently. Captain doesn't wish for the Golden Dream to dock at the harbor. At least you know how to settle the room's payment. Klein didn't say a word as he maintained his austere attitude. He draped himself with a coat and took his hat before walking towards his luxurious suite. When his back disappeared into the corner of a staircase and vanished from Danitz's sight, Danitz shrank back into his room and clenched his fist, pumping them into the air. Wonderful! Wonderful! TM finally free. He didn't delay in wearing his cap and heading to the front desk of the Wind of Azure Inn to settle the bill. He informed them that this didn't mean that he was checking out. Danitz quickly hit the streets and ran straight for a place known as the Seaweed Bar. He found the air fresh and invigorating. After he took a few steps, he suddenly noticed bounty posters pasted along the walls around a bend. Blazing Danitz, 5,500 pounds. The posters were just 2 steps away from Danitz. That familiar face allowed for a clear comparison with his cap-wearing face. Danitz clenched his teeth and revealed a sorrowful smile. He hurriedly pressed down his cap, nearly concealing his normal line of sight. But even so, he still felt uneasy. He went to a recent department store and bought a gray scarf. He wrapped it around his neck and hid his nose and mouth in it. At this point in time, Danitz relaxed somewhat as he sped up his pace and rushed for his destination. The Seaweed Bar was a place where gangs gathered. It was common for infamous pirates to appear there. Although this place wasn't like the Swordfish Bar or Amorous Leaf Bar that allowed access to a lot of information and resources, it had its own unique niche. It had many resourceful secret channels. What Danitz wanted to do was buy a scalp ticket to Gallegos, as this wouldn't need him to provide any identification. He knew very well that be it in the past or present, his bounty poster would be plastered across all the ticket booths. He had bought the first-class tickets to the White Agate via the same method as well. After entering the bar, Danitz didn't take off his cap and scarf. He carefully surveyed the area and found Daniel, who sold scalp tickets. He didn't directly approach him, and instead retracted his gaze from the thin and somewhat swarthy man who was in his 30s. He began searching for someone unfamiliar. After a round of choices, Danitz squeezed through the crowd and arrived beside a lad who was drinking at the bar counter. He tapped him on the shoulder and suppressed his voice. "Do me a favor." "What?" The lad turned his head warily and ended up seeing a suspicious man. The lower half of his face was covered in a gray scarf, and the cap on his head nearly hid his eye. He revealed almost nothing about his face. Such a dress-up simply meant that he was suspicious. This was because the Rorstad archipelago's lowest temperature during the winter was about 10 degrees C. Danitz pointed at Daniel. "See that guy over there? Buy me a ticket for Gallegos tomorrow." He handed over 3 one-pound notes and chuckled. "The rest is yours." Although a scalp ticket was much more expensive than a retail ticket, Gallegos wasn't too far, making £3 more than sufficient. Of course, this was also because the journey was relatively shorter, and there was no need for him to buy a first-class ticket. The reason why Danitz didn't buy it himself was because he was worried that Daniel would recognize him, bringing him unwanted trouble. Back when his bounty was only £3,000, pirates and adventurers at his level or lower had to consider how many people were needed to take him down. The bounty received wasn't something that could make them forget about their fear towards Vice Admiral Iceberg and the risk of losing their lives. Hence, very few people would take the initiative to attack him. As such, his safety was pretty much guaranteed in such black market. But now, his bounty reward had already reached £5,500. Even if several people joined forces, the amount of money each of them could get was a sizable sum. Furthermore, there were many people out at sea who were desperados. Apart from that, there would be people who found their own bounties too low and wished to prove their strength. These people would definitely challenge a target like Danitz, who was infamous but was of little risk. It was precisely because of this that Danitz was afraid that Daniel would betray him. Therefore, he hired a random person to buy it on his behalf. The lad held the cash and gave Danitz another look before getting up from his seat. He then walked towards Daniel. He deliberately slowed down his footsteps when he walked past some drunkards as he whispered to them. When Danitz saw this scene, he suddenly became guarded. He thought of a problem. With him acting suspiciously, it was very obvious that there was a problem with him. He was a perfect target for being betrayed. Do you think my reputation as blazing was bought?" Danitz planned on teaching the lad a lesson after he obtained the ticket. At this point, he discovered that a familiar figure had walked in. He was an infamous pirate, Blue Eyes Meath, with a bounty of £2,800. And this pirate clearly knew this group of people were planning to betray him. Blue Eyes Meath still has a few rather powerful subordinates. Danitz didn't hesitate to get up and head for the bar's back door. His speed increased as he agilely forced himself through the drunkards and escaped from the bar. Then, with his rich anti-tracking skills, he completely escaped from the group of people. Danitz didn't dare to stay on the streets since it was already dark. The patrolling police and soldiers would begin increasing. He went straight back to the Wind of Azure Inn and opened the door to the luxurious suite. Inside, he saw Jam and Sparrow admiring the dusk. Danitz had a thought as he forced a smile. "There's something. I forgot to mention it just now. Captain wishes to ask if you have any interest in meeting her at Gallego." This was a question he had previously kept secret. He had planned on returning and telling his captain that Jam and Sparrow wasn't interested. But now he realized that he had a low chance of surviving in Bayam once he was separated from the crazy adventurer. Head to Gallegos to meet Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina Edward. Klein was taken aback, nearly frowning in the process. This wasn't something he considered unacceptable, but instead a chance for him to use this face-to-face meeting to ask about matters with trite details that were cumbersome to pin down. It was possible for him to be inspired and gain information for his subsequent advancement and high-sequence potion formula. One more friend, one more channel. Klein silently muttered this sentence before taking out a heavy gold coin. He divined if there was any danger in front of blazing Danitz. The shiny gold coin flipped into the air and tumbled down into Klein's palm, tails facing up. This implied a negative response, which meant that there wasn't much danger meeting Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina in Gallego. Klein shifted his gaze upwards at Danitz and calmly said, "Okay. On the captain's behalf, I thank you for accepting the invitation." Danitz heaved a sigh of relief and beamed, his brows easing. Klein took a look at the wall clock and said, "I'll first head to the washroom." "Head to the washroom? You mean you plan on heading out later to buy a ticket for me?" Danitz's gaze followed Jam and Sparrow's body as he sharply read in between the lines. After using spirit dowsing to confirm things above the gray fog, Klein washed his hands and left the washroom and said to Danitz, "Let's go." "Me?" Danitz pointed at himself. Klein put on his coat and nodded. "There's no need to, right? You can directly find Ellen and get him to help us buy 2 tickets. In this rare occasion, Danitz sincerely provided a suggestion. Klein coldly swept his glance across him and didn't say a word. He wore his hat and went out the door. Danitz trembled and swallowed his second suggestion of buying fake identification documents and used Jam and Sparrow's ability to change appearances to buy 2 tickets via official channel. He wrapped the scarf around him once again and pressed down on his cap before quickly following Jam and Sparrow. After nearly 20 minutes, Klein pointed ahead where there was a noisy commotion. "Is it there?" That was the Seaweed Bar, where Danitz had failed to accomplish the purchase of scalp tickets. Yes, Danitz never expected them to circle over and was momentarily stunned. Along the way, he had roughly described his early experience, therefore, he wasn't sure why Jam and Sparrow would return here. Amid his thought, he suddenly had a guess as he blurted, "Are you going to seek revenge for me? This fellow might be crazy, but he's quite nice to his friends." His act of venturing out into Banzi Harbor for Elend and the others is an example. Danitz couldn't help but reflect on the matter. Klein shot him a glance and didn't say a word. He widened his strides and walked into the Seaweed Bar. "There's really no need," Danitz followed behind as he weakly persuaded him. If he wasn't afraid of escalating the matter, he would have baked those bunch of backstabbing bastards in cement and sank them to the bottom of the sea. The bar was noisy and lively, with local music reverberating through it, bringing about a trance-like feeling. Danitz seriously surveyed the area in an attempt to find the bunch of backstabbers, as well as the infamous pirate, Blue Eyes Me. "That's Daniel," Danitz casually introduced the black market merchant. "What a pity that this place is just too chaotic. I've no idea if that group of people are still around," he thought with some regret. Klein traced his gaze and touched creeping hunger with his right hand. He turned his head and looked at Danitz, saying with his usual expression, "Take off your scarf." His tone was akin to instructing Danitz to buy a glass of beer. Danitz was left stunned on the spot as he wondered if he had heard wrong. Klein widened the ends of his mouth and said, "Take off your scarf. Do not make me repeat thrice." "Why?" Danitz choked back his question under the icy cold and crazy stare. He blankly removed his scarf in puzzlement, and he had a baffling feeling that the people around him were sizing him up and also recognizing him as the great pirate worth 5,500 pounds, Blazing Danitz. Klein maintained his smile that concealed madness and continued instructing. Take off your cap. Go over and buy a ticket. In an instant, Danitz felt as though he had been struck by lightning. He nearly leaped up. TLL be recognized. Under J.M. and Sparrow's stare, his voice became softer and softer. At this point in time, he had already understood what J.M. and Sparrow was up to. He wishes to use my worth as 5,500 pounds, as bait to fish out those greedy pirates and powerhouses behind those gangs. Dogs T. Think I thought he was nice to his friends a moment ago. No, why would I even consider him my friend? This son of a beach. Danitz kept cursing inwardly with vulgarity. He couldn't put up any resistance since he knew how crazy J.M. and Sparrow was. This was a madman who was even thinking of hunting a pirate admiral. Danitz revealed a twisted smile. As he slowly turned his head back, he took off his cap and slowly walked towards Daniel. Round him, gazes swept past him and paused for 2 seconds before they were retracted. As the drunkards moved away from him like the receding tide, they opened a wide path for him as though the ocean was split. Upon seeing their reaction, Danitz was surprised at this turn of events despite his horror and concern. This is the might of a great pirate. This is what it feels like to be the center of attention. Damn it, I heard someone say my name. Someone is whispering blazing. Danitz knew he had been recognized. As he walked forward anxiously, he hung his hands down and prepared to do battle. Among the crowd, Blue Eyes Meath blurted out, Danitz. Blazing Danitz. His subordinates exchanged looks and said excitedly, Boss, it's really Blazing Danitz. 5,500 pounds. Shall we attack? Meath narrowed his azure blue eyes and raised his left arm, slapping the back of his subordinate's head. You stupid. If Blazing Danitz were a stupid like you, he would have been killed numerous times. He dared to appear here because he's not afraid of being attacked. He has a powerhouse hiding behind him. Meath suddenly felt horrified as he looked around. He suspected that Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina Edwards had secretly arrived in the city of Generosity, Bayam. Through the gaps in between the crowd, he saw a young gentleman in a black double-breasted frock coat. He wore a half-top hat and had black hair and brown eyes. He looked thin, but he had an angled face. Without any words, Meath's spiritual perception told him that this was a terrifying existence. His high spiritual perception had previously brought him numerous troubles, but it had also helped him successfully evade even more danger. Let's go. He suppressed his voice as he ordered. Then, with the help of the patrons blocking him, he fled from the bar's back door just like how Danitz did previously. Danitz came right in front of Daniel, while shuddering in fear, before buying 2 tickets to Gallegos from a blank and horrified opponent. Even after he returned the way he came, and received the signal from J.M. and Sparrow to walk out the bar, he didn't notice anyone suddenly assaulting him. Isn't it said that there are many desperados among pirates? Indeed, a last-minute and rush trap is hardly effective. Something abnormal usually implies that something is amiss. Of course, one can use the abnormality to scare the enemy. Unfortunately, Klein pressed down on his hat before following Danitz out. At that moment in time, Danitz was loitering around a street lamp. When he saw J.M. and Sparrow walk out, he barely smiled and said, Can I wear the scarf and cap already? Haha, that group of cowards. Yes. Klein didn't stop as he sped up once he reached the other end of the street. Danitz's pupils contracted as he hurriedly chased after him and inquired, Why are we suddenly running? Klein didn't turn his head as he calmly said, Do you wish to stay here to be invited back by the mandated punisher? As he spoke, he took out a paper figurine, threw it out and burned it to ashes. Only then did Danitz snap to his senses. Although that group of cowards didn't dare to attack him, they definitely had the courage to report him. If he was successfully taken down, they still had a chance of receiving parts of the reward. They ran all the way into a secluded alley before J.M. and Sparrow stopped. Only then did Danitz have the time to wrap his scarf properly and wear his cap. Where are we heading now? Danitz asked with a slight pant. Klein glanced at him. Find Elend. The corners of Danitz's mouth twitched, yearning to throw a fireball over. To buy tickets to the Delinius Island, Klein added as he passed through the alley. Delinius Island was the first island past the south of the Rorstad archipelago. Right, there's a ship there that heads for Gallegos. Now, with everyone's attention focused on the liners from Bayam to Gallegos, no one would imagine that we'd take a detour to Delinius Island and travel from there. Danitz followed as he was in line. On Tuesday morning, Klein personally helped Danitz don a disguise, making him look like a mixed-blood who wore gold-rimmed glasses. Although there was no way to use his faceless powers, it was still at least 10 times better than Danitz's own attempts at disguising himself. They successfully boarded the ship and prepared to head south to Delinius Island Harbor. The journey was expected to take 10 hours. Whoosh! The liner left the harbor and steered into the sea. Under the bright sunlight, thin clouds, and blue skies, this hybrid-powered ship silently sailed through the gentle waves amid the cold breeze all the way into the afternoon. At this moment, Klein was inside the cabin, pondering over some content in the Book of Secrets. Danitz was pacing about, thinking about how he could brag to his mates. Suddenly, their vision darkened, as though a cloud had drifted over to blot out the sun. Klein subconsciously looked out and saw that a gigantic pitch-black sailboat had appeared at some moment in time. It was nearly 100 meters long and had its sail fully open. By the side were rows of cannon. Before it approached, it steered in a different direction, but it still made the surroundings seem to have a black sun pass by. Danitz revealed a reverent and apprehensive expression that was mixed with a longing but abhorrent look. He hissed before whispering in a dreamy manner, "Dark Emperor." Upon seeing the gigantic black sailboat, Klein's first reaction was fear and wariness. He suspected that the demigod, king of the five seas Nast, was here for him. But he quickly refuted that guess. This was because, apart from using the Dark Emperor card in the spirit world, he had nearly never made the card of blasphemy appear in the real world ever since he came out to sea. There were only 2 or 3 times when they appeared due to a summoning before it quickly entered the spirit world. With the gray fog screening abilities and the card of blasphemy's anti-divination and anti-prophecy traits, it's impossible for Nast to lock onto me. Klein calmed down as he got up to walk towards the window. Together with Danitz, he looked at the Dark Emperor, which defied sailboat logic. The gigantic ship slowly approached in the massive shadows as the scene on the deck became increasingly clear. The sailors were either washing the deck or bragging on the shipboard. None of them had drawn their cutlasses or guns. There was no sign of them planning to plunder the ship. Near the cabin, there was a mottled stone chair that was 2 to 3 meters high. On it sat a colossal man that was comparable to a giant. Before he could take in Nast's appearance, Danitz couldn't help but lower his head as his body became numb and trembled, to the point of prostrating himself. Klein also sensed the inexplicable sense of might and awe. He didn't forcibly resist it to keep his head up and continue looking at Nast. This had a high chance of attracting his attention, bringing him unwanted trouble. As a person with many secrets, he had to bow his head when required. Klein retracted his gaze as he admired the rugs on the deck. After an unknown period of time, he saw the sunlight illuminate the area again as the shadow vanished. He looked up and could no longer see the gigantic pitch-black sailboat. The wind and seas were calm, and the skies were clear. Why would he suddenly be here? Wasn't it said that he was still at the Fog Sea recently? Danitz frowned as he muttered to himself in puzzlement. That Dark Emperor can cruise through the spirit world, so it's very normal for it to come all the way from the Fog Sea in a span of a few days. This is also probably one of the reasons why Nast is the greatest of the 4 kings, Klein thought to himself. He believed that Nast was lured by the Dark Emperor card, but it was likely that Nast could only determine a vague area. Klein retracted his gaze and sat back down as though nothing had happened. The straight-line distance between Bayam and Delinius wasn't great, but a sufficiently safe sea route was filled with twists and turns, so it took the liner until sunset before it reached the dock. After that, Klein changed his appearance and used a fake identity to buy 2 early tickets and set off before it got dark. They arrived at Gargis at dawn. Danitz didn't enter the city and instead brought Klein on a detour to a private harbor. They then took a simple fishing boat and set off to sea. After nearly 2 hours, Klein saw a sailboat which was dozens of meters long. It was clean and produced a golden luster from the sunlight reflected on it. Compared to similar sailboats, it appeared extremely special. Along the central axis was the main cannon, which was stacked with symbols and patterns. Faint but pure light swirled around it. That's the cannon of purification. It can only be used 10 times before 6 priests of light are needed to hold a ritual. They will pray to the corresponding deity to fill it up with spirituality, Danitz introduced smugly. A gigantic version of a charm. After a certain period of time, it will likely automatically lose its spirituality. Backing Vice Admiral Iceberg is the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun. or one that can nurture priests of light. Klein's remained stoic as he mumbled inwardly. Back when he first saw the golden dream in Danitz's dream, he wasn't too surprised by the main canon. After all, dreams didn't need to adhere to logic. Perhaps Danitz had seen an ironclad warship, and its main cannon had left a deep impression on him, causing him to reproduce it in his dream. To Klein's surprise, the golden dream really had something that required extremely copious amounts of knowledge and mysticism. It wasn't something an ordinary faction could produce. Soon, the golden dream dispatched a dinghy and quickly steered towards the fishing boat. Danitz spread his hands open before clenching them tightly. He then jumped down and landed in the dinghy without causing it to shake. He whistled and struck palms with the pirate who was steering. He found the former feeling of ruling over the ocean again. However, this excitement didn't last long as the dinghy behind him suddenly dipped a little. One more person had joined them. Forgot about that madman, Danitz wiped away his smile and sat down. Klein observed the pirates and pressed down his hat. He sat down calmly without a word. Before long, he landed on the deck of the Golden Dream and saw Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina Edwards standing in silence. This pirate admiral was nearly identical to how she looked when they met in the dream. There weren't any changes to her hair or looks. She now wore dark trousers with a pair of leather boots instead of wearing a dress. She also had a valiant bearing to her wisdom and beauty. She's more like a pirate this time than a teacher. Klein nodded gently and smiled politely. Good morning, ma'am, Captain. Good morning, Mr. Jamin, Edwina replied with a smile. She turned around and walked to a spot where fishing nets were being hung out to dry. She signaled the pirates to walk away and get busy with their own work. Fishing nets, as expected of a pirate crew that's more like treasure hunters, this is in preparation to improve their meal. Klein followed in silence. Danitz very naturally found a few of his companions he was most familiar with to have drinks and to brag to. Of course, he didn't let down his guard. From time to time, he would glance over, afraid that his captain would end up exchanging blows with Jam and Sparrow. He was ready to get his companions to join the brawl at any moment. This time, Klein didn't wait for Edwina to explain why she had invited him. After 2 seconds of silence, he asked, "What do you know of Tracy?" He planned on asking all his questions before listening to Edwina's motive. He wanted to prevent himself from being embarrassed to ask further after rejecting a request he couldn't agree to. Tracy? Edwina's eyes quivered a little. She's a demoness, a sequence 5 demoness of affliction. Demoness? Klein nearly lost it. He felt that his fate seemed to be intertwined with demonesses. First it was Witch Trissy, and then there was Demoness of Pleasure Madame Sharon, and then there was Demoness of Pleasure Trissy Cheek, and a high-ranking demoness he only heard the voice of. Now there was another demoness of affliction, Tracy. Edwina didn't sense the upheavals he was going through and continued. She's different from the typical demoness. She has her own ideals and pursuits. She's quite an oddity in the demoness sect. However, she would still work for the organization doing work such as human trafficking or something else. Different from the typical demoness. She doesn't give up on herself and chooses to give pleasure to women. Klein suddenly thought of red-haired Helen. However, he couldn't be certain because not every demoness was the result of a man changing into a woman. There were real women who wished to become an assassin. After asking for the details, Klein deliberated and asked, "We met Nast and his Dark Emperor on the way here. In the recent months, matters involving you, Senner, Tracy, and Nast have happened in this area of the sea. This is rather abnormal. 4 out of the 4 kings and 7 admirals had involved themselves in the Rorsted Sea in a short span of time. This wasn't even including the recently recruited Tarot Club member, Admiral of Stars Catley. In terms of probability, this was indeed quite abnormal. Of course, Klein had some theories, but he wished to see if Vice Admiral Iceberg was able to provide some fresh insight. Edwina listened without saying a word. She pulled the edge of a fishing net and held it in front of her. She took out a fountain pen, a brass dagger, metallic bottles, and other things from her pockets in the inner section of her belt and placed them on the spread-out net. They latched on firmly without moving. It didn't seem like there would be any interaction between them. At this moment, Edwina bent over and picked up a rock used to press down the net, and she placed it in the middle of the open net. The net immediately depressed, causing the surroundings to contract. The fountain pen, dagger, and bottles tumbled towards the center and gathered beside the rock. TT's probably something like this. Some unknown existence has appeared in the net of fate and is pulling us towards it, Edwina explained simply. This is like an actual model of the law of convergence for Bayonder characteristics, Klein thought as he nodded. With regards to this, he was both enlightened but puzzled as well. He was enlightened because Edwina's explanation was nearly the same as his guess, but he was puzzled because it couldn't be used to analyze the problem. The King of the Five Seas Nast appeared because of me. Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy can also be barely explained, since I did come into contact with Trissy Cheek. As for Vice Admiral Iceberg and Admiral of Blood, I can't find a reason. Perhaps it's purely a coincidence. Besides, it's the latter that attracted the former out. Klein retracted his gaze and asked about something else. Then he said, "Ma'am, Captain, is there a reason for inviting me here?" Edwina gave him a deep look and said, "Your identity indicates that you came from Backland. According to what I know, this identity isn't authentic enough. There's no powerful bounty hunter named Jamin Sparrow from there. The faction backing you is very powerful. Furthermore, it has quite an extensive network in Backland. You managed to so quickly notice a problem with my identity." Klein didn't panic as he smiled calmly. "Everyone will have some secrets." Edwina remained silent for a few seconds without pressing the issue. She then said, "Not long before Calvatua died, you sacrificed something to it." Klein turned his head slightly and swept his gaze across Danitz, who was drinking beer. "Cough, cough." Alarmed, Danitz spewed the beer all over himself. Klein retracted his gaze and didn't deny or admit it as he looked at Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina. Edwina continued without a change in expression. "After Calvatua died, the sea god is still replying to its believers. Iceberg's collector's room, is she suspecting something?" Klein looked straight into Edwina's eyes without moving them away. Nor did his eyes blink or dodge. After knowing that Danitz had divulged his sacrificial ritual to Calvatua before it died, Klein had the necessary preparation. If he wasn't standing on the shipboard and was instead sitting on a soda, then he definitely would have crossed his right leg and leaned back to give a calm and composed answer. He smiled as he raised his left hand. He introduced with a calm tone, "This glove of mine is called Creeping Hunger." Klein believed that Danitz, who had witnessed him in combat, had definitely passed the relevant details on to his captain. Therefore, with Vice Admiral Iceberg, Edwina being of equal rank as Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos, it wasn't difficult for her to guess that he had acquired Creeping Hunger. In that case, taking the initiative to divulge it gave him a psychological advantage rather than being exposed by her. And for him to suddenly mention it gave it a double meaning. First, he was hinting to her that he had an organization backing him, one that could kill Vice Admiral Hurricane and orchestrate Calvatua's death and reply to its believers in its stead. Second, it was a warning for Edwina that she was not to attempt to investigate or delve deeper into the matter. Otherwise, the instantaneous death of Vice Admiral Hurricane awaited her. At this moment in time, Klein continued maintaining Jamin Sparrow's persona. He didn't directly threaten her or refuse to admit it. Instead, he provided a calm answer that hid madness within it. Edwina Edwards nodded slightly and suddenly changed topic. He planned on providing a certain amount of assistance to the resistance in the Rorsted archipelago, mainly in food and fabric. Assistance? Her backing faction is against loan, or it just wants to make things difficult for the Church of Storm. Klein wiped his smile and calmly replied, "This has nothing to do with me." "Don't expect me to trip up," he said silently to himself. Edwina turned her head and raised her arm to point to blazing Danitz, who was drinking, while secretly stealing glances. T will entrust him to handle it, including contacting the resistance and confirming the time. We'll arrange for a private harbor, and I wish you can provide sufficient help. Danitz spewed out a golden waterfall from his mouth. Bam, bam, bam. The two pirates sitting beside him laughed as they bent their backs and struck the deck, spewing out the beer that they had just drunk. One of them had dark skin like he was covered in a layer of metal skin. His waist was rather thick, and although he wasn't fat, he had no curvature to speak of. Edwina retracted her gaze and added in an unhurried manner before Klein could speak, "You're an adventurer. I believe you won't decline a job that pays well." "You really have found me an excellent excuse," Klein smiled in response. "Of course." He didn't ask how much the payment was, while Edwina seemed to forget mentioning it. This intelligent and beautiful pirate admiral gloomily said, "Senner got someone to pass me the news that he's willing to buy the key of the giants, which I previously discovered, for £5,000. It was the item proclaimed to be Death's key. It was a gigantic black iron key that nearly made Dennett's lose his life in baying. Klein suspected that it didn't originate from the Dark Second Epoch, but it was something that was connected to the Giant King's court. She's hinting at me to offer a price. Klein was first taken aback before he came to a realization. He couldn't help but inwardly mumble, £5,000. I don't even know if the key is of any use, or if it really involves the Giant King's court. If it doesn't have anything to do with it, can I return it for a refund? Besides, there's no prior information about it. Even if I take it above the gray fog to divine it, I wouldn't receive any effective revelation. Yes, a simple inference is that if it doesn't involve the Giant King's court but some other treasure that I have no idea about, then it would be useless if I buy it. The only benefit is that it will disrupt Admiral of Blood's plan. It harms him without benefiting me. If it involves the Giant King's court, Admiral of Blood is unlikely to find the target location even if he bought it, as it's located in the forsaken land of the gods. Besides, I plan to hunt him. When the time comes, I can obtain the key without spending any money. It's equivalent to having him buy it for me and watch over it for some time. Although such thoughts are very idealistic, it's not impossible. Klein pondered for a few seconds and said, it might be hiding a huge secret. He deliberately mentioned this to make Vice Admiral Iceberg unwilling to sell the gigantic black iron key to Admiral of Blood Center. It was to prevent the latter from rapidly strengthening himself after obtaining the treasure and step into the demigod realm. That would bring a considerable calamity upon Klein. Edwina listened silently and didn't continue on the topic. She turned her body halfway around and pointed at the cabin's entrance. Breakfast has been prepared for you. Thank you. Klein took off his hat and bowed. As he followed Vice Admiral Iceberg into the cabin, he quickly recalled the conversation they just had and sought out the true motive behind Edwina's invitation. From Jam and Sparrow's identity problems, to the mystical item suspected to be creeping hunger, to the matter of the sacrifice to Calvatua while the Dead Sea God continued responding to believers, all of these matters put together does allow one to imagine that I have a secret organization backing me, one whose motives are unknown. As for the faction that Vice Admiral Iceberg belongs to, it's very wary, guarded, and interested in this matter. Therefore, it got her to probe me in person to see if they can obtain something. They're still rather friendly at the moment. Extending their assistance to the resistance is a way to convey their intention. It seems they're leaning towards cooperating with the organization backing. Of course, the unknown always leaves others afraid. Without grasping the situation, the chances of Vice Admiral Iceberg and company attacking me is very, very low. Heh, if they realize that the secret organization backing me was established only about half a year ago, including the World and Miss Zio, whose connection has been established but not recruited, there aren't more than 10 people. I wonder if they will get so infuriated that they end up losing control. As his thoughts raced, Klein entered the cabin and followed a dim passageway, passing through one wooden door after another. He followed Edwina up some stairs and arrived at a brighter second level. Before entering the pirates' dining hall, they passed by a half-opened room. Klein casually glanced inside and saw a gigantic black iron key sitting on a wooden table. These items are evidence from our various treasure hunting expeditions. Most of them are mementos, while others have yet to show their value and require further study. Edwina appeared cold, but her explanations were in great detail. It had the feeling like she was afraid that he wouldn't understand her or was left puzzled. And when she mentioned the word study, her aqueous blue eyes clearly lit up a little. Evidence of the various treasure hunting expeditions. Klein couldn't help but look inside carefully. At this point, Edwina pushed open the door and walked in. She then introduced in passing, "This is a gold coin from the Fourth Epoch's Solomon Empire." Klein's gaze shifted over and saw a coin placed inside a frame. It was entirely dark gold in color, as though it was combined from two semicircles of different dimensions. It looked extremely asymmetrical, and there was a sharp crown engraved on its surface. It looked very similar to the crown worn on the King of the Five Seas, Nast. Edwina was like an owner who liked to flaunt her collection. She began introducing the items in the room, making Klein recall a familiar person, old Mr. Eye of Wisdom, the great detective, Isengard Stanton. In regards to the trait of flaunting collections, they're very similar. Is this a tendency of people with huge collections? Wait, Mr. Stanton had studied in Lemberg for 4 years. Vice Admiral Iceberg's description includes information that Edwina Edwards that hails from Lemberg. This, Lemberg's capital, is the headquarters of the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. Mr. Stanton also admitted that he converted his faith to the God of Knowledge and Wisdom while studying abroad. Could the faction backing Vice Admiral Iceberg be that? Klein listened in thought until Edwina stopped in front of the huge iron black key. Just like he had seen in the dream, the key was about the size of a 7-string zither. An ordinary human would have to wrap their arms around it to move it. It was dull and ancient-looking. The patterns on it are similar to the City of Silver's style. It clearly has giant traits. Klein nodded and was just about to retract his gaze when he heard Edwina say, "You can study it. You are letting me study it. You probably have no idea how many latent problems I've triggered in the past. Aren't you afraid that the golden dream will disappear once you let me study it?" Klein criticized himself in a self-deprecatory manner before reaching out his right hand to touch the black iron key that seemed to belong to a giant's. He found it ice cold to the touch, and regardless of how much spirituality he injected into it, it was useless. "Unfortunately, I cannot bring it above the gray fog to study it." Klein retracted his right hand and shook his head indiscernibly. He shifted his gaze onto a book in goatskin placed on the same table. On the brown cover were words written in ancient Fasak, "Grossel's Travel." TT originates from a sunken ship. It had been soaked at the bottom of the sea for 165 years without suffering any damage, Edwina introduced. It records a story about a giant named Grossel. He had decided to head to the nation of Frost to hunt the king of the north, a powerful frost dragon. Along the way he encounters companions, a female elf, a devout ascetic, an aristocrat of the Solomon Empire, and a lone soldier. The story develops until they encounter the king of the north, before it suddenly comes to a halt. It's not the end, but the later pages cannot be opened no matter what methods are used. You can give it a try. This isn't a notebook in a journal style, but rather a novel. This novel sure is odd. It puts together characters from different epochs and eras. It should be something that was recently produced. Klein flipped through the book and allowed the yellowish-brown pages to slide past one after another. The content was roughly what Edwina said, but the story appeared rather abrupt and fractured. It kept making Klein suspect if he had missed a paragraph. For example, the protagonists would become familiar with one another moments after encountering each other as strangers. Soon he browsed to the last few pages and found that they were stuck together. There was no way he could pry them apart. Such effects probably can be dealt with above the gray fog. I wonder what sort of accidents might happen. Klein turned his head to look at Vice Admiral Iceberg. Edwina fell silent for a moment before saying, "If you wish to have it, I can sell it to you. I've studied it for years without gleaning anything from it. However, I have a condition." "What is it?" Klein returned with a question. Edwina pursed her lips and said, "If you figure out something, you have to tell me the result, so that I won't have to be puzzled over it. As long as you agree to this condition, I can sell it to you for cheap." Klein's interest was suddenly piqued. "How much?" £8,000, Edwina said calmly. Klein deliberately pondered as he nodded indifferently. "I'll consider it. I'll consider how to pretend that this never happened," he thought silently to himself. And 3,000 years ago, Vice Admiral Iceberg, Edwina, didn't show any changes in her expression when she heard Jam Sparrow say that he needed to consider it. She nodded calmly. "No hurry. He seems to feel that I'm unable to make the decision regarding a transaction of this scale, and that I need to seek advice from the secret organization backing me. Is this a problem of me not being able to make the decision? This is a problem of not having the money." Klein lampooned and closed Grossel's Travel. He asked in a deep voice, "Do you know who the author is? What happened to the people who last possessed this book?" Edwina walked in front of him and reached out her right hand. She rubbed the cover with her fingertip and said, "The owners from before cannot be identified, as the sinking of the ship has resulted in the relevant information being lost to history. Similarly, we are unable to confirm who the author is." "Oh, the book doesn't include the author's name. Have used some mystical arts to study it, and discovered that the goatskin was created at least 3,000 years ago, before the cataclysm. This is why I believe it's worth at least £8,000. A book from 3,000 years ago. There's a dragon, an elf, and a human ascetic, a Solomon Empire noble, and a lone soldier. These are all concepts from years later. A magical book that contains the power of prophecy. Or did someone specially use an ancient goatskin to create it? But it's meaningless to do so. It's purely a hoax. Klein deliberately curled the corners of his mouth without any intent of smiling. The giant's name is Grosel. Could the author be Roselle? No, Roselle's name originated from a root word in yacht. When ancient Fasak evolved into Intis, there was a second change, making it have a different meaning. Edwina explained in detail the origins of Roselle's name. It left Klein stunned, as he felt like he was back in school. He nodded gently and said in an unperturbed tone, "If it's an ancient piece of work, I'm very curious as to why a frost dragon would be named the King of the North. What sequence and pathway does it correspond to?" Edwina raised her gaze from Grosel's travels and looked at Klein. Before the appearance of the first blasphemy slate, there was no concept of sequences and pathway. Furthermore, many creatures didn't abide by such arrangements. In that epoch, chaos and mania was the basic attitude to everything. Some dragons might gather many Beyonder characteristics related to frost, just like a demoness's frost, a zombie's frost, and a weather warlock's frost. As such, it would possess rather powerful strength and a relatively high level. Of course, such a gathering would definitely lead to death and a loss of control. This means that if it doesn't die, it would definitely lose control and become a monster. However, a dragon is a monster in and of itself. If there are many similar products of this sort from the dragons, giants, and elves, then it can be understood why the second epoch is known as the Dark Epoch. Klein pondered for a moment and inquired as though he was talking to himself. This results in the wastage of Beyonder characteristics. Edwina looked at him for a few seconds. Emperor Roselle once said this: "Whatever separates will definitely converge, and whatever converges will definitely separate." The emperor said that before. I understand the first part. That's another form of saying the law of convergence, of Beyonder characteristics. But what does the second part mean? After the convergence happens to a certain extent, it would tend to separate and dissociate. When one doesn't belong to a particular pathway, the extremely chaotic convergent mix will cause a dissociation. The more chaotic it is, the more repulsion there is between the characteristics. Such words aren't likely to be said to anyone. It definitely isn't something that's spread out in the public last time. I guess from the Vice Admiral's usage of the Roselle's dream spell and her last name that she's a descendant of one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, Edwards. It's extremely possible, after the Emperor perished, their family escaped to Lemberg and gradually converted their faith to the god of knowledge and wisdom. What a good teacher. She answers any question. Klein didn't speak further as he continued admiring Vice Admiral Iceberg's collection. At the same time, he had some thoughts. He planned on asking Little Sun via the world during the tarot gathering if he knew of the book, Grosel's Travel. Of course, in order to prevent the hanged man from sensing something problematic with the world and hence figure out that something was amiss with the fool, he decided to communicate in private while blocking everyone else. After a brief excursion of the room, Edwina led Klein out and entered the captain's room in the dining hall. The relatively special food here is yogurt. You can add strawberry jam and other things. You can also directly add honey. Edwina pointed to the row of food outside. There's some dried fish that isn't bad. They come from the deep sea, species that have yet to be named. As she spoke, she gestured for Klein to take the food for himself to bring back to the room. She then got up and made herself an example. Klein took some yogurt of unknown origins and added a few spoonfuls of honey. Then he carried his tray and placed pork sausages, buttered bread, and other food on it. During this process, he saw a young man dressed in a white shirt and black vest, decked out with a flowery bow tie, looking more like an office worker than a pirate, approach Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina and have a hushed exchange with her. The man had pretty good looks with almost blonde hair other than his slightly black hair roots. His hair was neatly combed to the side. His eyes were a very light lake green color, and his nose was sharp. He had thin lips, and that made him exude a trustworthy vibe. Don't be fooled by that guy's appearance. He's a wolfish can. He stinks deep down. Dennis whispered in contempt, having entered the pirate's dining hall and arriving beside Klein at some point in time. Klein turned his head and glanced at him without saying a word. This was because he knew Danitz would offer to explain without him egging him on. Without waiting for Danitz to speak, a man with a swollen waist beside him said with a crude and sharp voice, He's the third mate, Jodson. He used to be a Casanova and part-time pirate, saying that he would steal our captain's heart, but he ended up getting a beating. He ended up staying to be educated. Dog's tea. In short, he's a bad egg. Danitz emphasized. He's a bad egg. Another pirated with iron-black skin echoed. Why do I have the nagging feeling that all of you are the same? Klein thought and said. Flowery bow-tie Jodson with a bounty of 200 pounds. Sequence 6. As expected of the standard jam and sparrow reaction, Danitz glanced to the side, as a lingering sense of fear was hidden within his contempt. He's not that strong, but he's very strange. In my brawls with him, no. When in combat, fireballs suddenly can't be used, and he will be able to replicate my fire powers. A very familiar description. Klein subconsciously glanced towards Jodson. After some careful thought, he recalled the familiarity. This is very similar to the sealed artifact, Blood Vessel Thief, found behind Tingen City's Channy's Gate. Klein had already forgotten the Blood Vessel Thief's sealed artifact number, but he still remembered clearly that it could temporarily steal a person's Beyonder powers for themselves. The corresponding pathway. Klein retracted his gaze and discovered that Danitz and his two companions were drinking while looking in that direction. Thinking back to how Danitz divulged his sacrifice to Calvatua, Klein took a cup of beer and carried his food tray towards the captain's dining room. He said indifferently, all of you like her, right? Fit behind Klein, there was the sound of alcohol being spewed out at the same time. He saw Danitz jump backward through the corner of his eye, looking at him in horror before turning his head in relief to size up his companion. They had unknowingly opened up a gap between themselves, as the look in their eyes turned complicated. They looked like they had the fury of being fooled. Klein didn't stop. He returned to the captain's dining room and enjoyed breakfast. After a while, Edwina carried a meal tray back. She drank a mouthful of milk and paused before saying, Danitz showed me the summoning ritual of your messenger. TT mentions that 1 gold coin is a necessary component. Team somewhat perplexed. Does it refer to lone gold coins, or those from Inti's, Faceak, or somewhere else? Their weights are all different, and the amount of gold they contain is different. Klein thought for a moment before saying, Lone's gold coin. This is also the gold coin that's worth the most. It's not like I need to pay for it myself, Klein added inwardly. Edwina nodded. Payment also needs to be done when receiving a reply. Different spirit world creatures have different hobbies, Klein said. He knew that Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina was a researcher of spirit world creatures, and he believed that she could understand what he meant. Furthermore, he wasn't lying. He just hid the fact that the messenger's owner could also pay for it. Yes, Edwina very seriously answered him. I once attempted to find a messenger, but I could only use trial and error for the incantation. Not only was it dangerous, but it was very difficult to satisfy the requirements. I eventually had to give up. This is one of the reasons. The other reason is that simulating the power of the undead isn't enough to sign the contract. Your incantation has given me quite the inspiration. Klein ate his breakfast in silence without explaining anything. This was because this was the knowledge he had learned from Mr. Azek. He wasn't at liberty to teach it to others without receiving permission from him. After a delicious and quiet breakfast, the Golden Dream approached a private harbor and dropped Klein and Danitz off. Danitz looked back at the glimmering golden ship and suddenly sighed. "I feel like my friendship has sunk into the ocean." Klein pressed down on his hat and calmly said, "Losers can always form alliances among themselves." Danitz was unsure whether he should be happy or sad. After changing their identities and creating fake identification, they successfully bought tickets back to Bayam and boarded the ship. Klein finally had a private space for himself. He entered the washroom and went above the gray fog and began scanning through the believer's prayers. This time, the first thing that appeared before him was the bald member of the resistance, Callie. "Honorable God, we have discovered the whereabouts of red-haired Helen. She's currently hiding in the Inti's embassy. This has been confirmed by a laundry maid and gardener.